on the French Revolution. We're going to transition to talking about a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. And really, there's two goals throughout this lecture and its related activities, and that is to determine whether or not Napoleon was an enemy or a son of the revolution, and to determine if Napoleon was an enlightened despot. And so when we talk about these two things throughout this lecture, I want you to also take a minute, though, right now, to pause and in the lecture activity to list some things that would make someone an enemy of the revolution and some things that would make people a son or a supporter of the revolution. So take a few minutes to do that now before we get into the rest of this lecture. So we left off in the previous lecture kind of going through all the different elements or steps along the way in this French Revolution. So we start with the National Assembly, then that goes into the Legislative Assembly, to the National Convention, to the Committee on Public Safety, and we end with the Directory, right, which is supposed to be a strong executive body of 5 men who would have a lot of say and control of what happened. And that Directory appointed a man named Napoleon Bonaparte, who was from an island called Corsica in the Mediterranean, which was kind of Italian at the time, controlled by France, but was traditionally an Italian island. And when he comes to rise through the ranks of the French military, he's eventually appointed by this Directory as the head of the French military during this time period, 1798, 1799. But still, despite the effort to kind of strengthen the government with the Directory, there's still a lot of political instability. And what Napoleon essentially does is that he organizes a coup. And a coup is when someone, typically in the military, attempts to overthrow the government. And so by force, he has the Directory dissolved, and he replaces it with a council of 3 men. And Napoleon, of course, is one of those men. But again, in the process of this coup, he also then forces himself to be named first consul, so essentially like the head of the 3, so to speak, and then quickly becomes dictator. And gets rid of the other 2 men on this council of 3. To justify his actions, he organizes a plebiscite, which is essentially a nationwide popular vote. And so in 1800, he organizes this plebiscite, and the French people actually vote. And according to this vote, there's debate among historians if it was corrupt or if Napoleon stuffed the ballots, things like that. But according to this plebiscite, this popular vote, the French overwhelmingly supported Napoleon as their leader, as their emperor, and voted for a new constitution. A plebiscite the next year actually gives Napoleon the title of emperor. So France, in the time from 1789 to 1800, goes from being a monarchy to a limited monarchy to a republic to a dictatorship and then to an empire, right? So that's kind of a dramatic change in the course of 11 years. Many in France at the time saw Napoleon, when he first comes to power, as a son of the revolution, as someone kind of meant to right in the ship, so to speak, of the French Revolution. And so Napoleon, right, he's an emperor and he wants to have an empire, but he's strategic about it. So he decides ultimately in 1803 to give up his American possessions, North American possessions, I should say, and he sells a huge chunk of land to the United States. This is what we know as the Louisiana Purchase today, because that was the Louisiana Territory. The Louisiana Territory essentially doubles the size of the United States of America at the time, and it's a dramatic change for the Americans. It's ultimately considered a loss for the French, but Napoleon wants to focus on his European empire, and so kind of with the money and funds from that, and lack of not having to worry about the military efforts in North America, he focuses his attention on parts of Italy and Netherlands, and he annexes or adds parts of Italy, northern Italy, and the Netherlands to his empire. Napoleon's biggest rival during this time period is the English, and he attempts to invade England. There's a battle of Trafalgar in which Napoleon loses a naval fight to the English, and that kind of stops his ability to ever be able to successfully invade England by land. But he does have more success on the mainland of Europe, and he comes to control large areas of German territory, German-speaking territory. At this point, Germany is still not a country as we know it today, but there are these small different principalities or kingdoms, and they all speak German. The kind of the remnants of this Holy Roman Empire. And so with the territory he manages to control, he establishes a kind of a puppet government, right? So he's not directly ruling it, but he has this say in what goes on. and he calls it the Confederation of the Rhine. And the Rhine is the Rhine River, and that is the border, one of the borders between France and Germany today. So it's kind of the parts of modern-day Germany that would be in the western part of modern-day Germany. So he has some successes in establishing this empire. All right, and something to think about as we go through right now is to think about, well, is creating an empire, is that something a supporter of the revolution would do, or does that make him an enemy of the revolution, right? Trying to conquer and expand, something to consider. This map here just kind of shows you the orange shaded land there. That is the land that Napoleon sells to the United States under the president at the time of the United States was President Thomas Jefferson. And as you can see, it's a massive piece of land that essentially doubles the size of the country. And then we have here a map kind of showing you the Empire of France and some of the lands that they come to control. So you can see over here we have the Empire of France. It takes control of the Dutch kingdom as well. And everything here kind of outlined in this red, all these small kingdoms like the Kingdom of Saxony, Westphalia, Bavaria, all these different kingdoms are technically still independent at the time, but they're under what's called a confederation, which is an agreement that these kingdoms entered into to work together. And it's known as the Confederation of the Rhine. And the French, Napoleon has a lot of control over what happens in this, right? They're essentially their ally. So just kind of giving you a visual of what Europe looks like in the early 1800s. But every leader makes mistakes, and Napoleon has some very important mistakes that will ultimately lead to his decline. So in 1806, kind of in the midst of war with England, what he decides to do is if he can't invade England, he's going to try to cut England off from mainland Europe. And so he begins to try to enforce a blockade, right, with his navy to block all European ports for English ships, right, trying to limit and prevent English ships from getting into European ports. He's unsuccessful in this attempt, and he causes a lot of economic damage to his own country in doing so. And so this ultimately, the continental system is a failure. Another failure is the Peninsular War, which is in 1808, or this begins in 1808. And this is Napoleon's effort to expand into Spain. And his goal is to replace the Spanish monarchy with his brother, name his brother the King of Spain. He does this, right, but then it leads to essentially a civil war in Spain, Spanish nationalism. The Spanish don't want to be ruled by the French, and so they resist. And on top of that, the English and other powers in Europe, like Prussia and Austria, get involved to try to prevent this from happening. So ultimately, Napoleon fails in keeping his brother on the throne in Spain. Napoleon's kind of most famous blunder or mistake is his attempted invasion of Russia. He does this in 1812. He's not the only one to make this mistake. Other people in the future, notably Adolf Hitler, will also make this mistake, right? Napoleon underestimated the severity of a Russian winter. And so he invades Russia. He's doing really well kind of getting there. Along the way, though, as he's invading Russia, he's using a scorched earth tactic, which means he burns farms, fields, supplies, right, as he moves along, which is meant to kind of discourage the Russians. But what happens is once winter arrives, and the winter in Russia is brutally cold, the French troops are totally unprepared. They're not prepared clothing-wise, and now they've destroyed all the infrastructure behind them, so there's not really a ready supply of food and things like that. Otherwise, it takes a long time for supplies to get then from France to Russia, right, at this time period. There's no planes. There's no railroads either at this time, so it's a real process. Thousands of his soldiers die due to the elements in winter, and on top of that, the Russians, who are used to the winter there and prepared for it, use a guerrilla warfare tactic where in small bands, they attack by surprise and then they retreat, and they attack by surprise and they retreat, and they're constantly moving around. And so all these things forces Napoleon to surrender his attempt to invade Russia, and he retreats, right? And he retreats with a very weakened army, both in numbers and in morale. And so at this point, with this attempt, it's clear that Napoleon seemingly wants to take over all of Europe. He attempted to take over England. He attempted to take over Spain. He tried to take over France. He successfully took over large parts of German territory. And so the Allied powers, people like Prussia, Austria, England, and Russia, all decide, they have to stop Napoleon. So they're all at war with Napoleon at this time. This is the 1812, 1813, 1814. The Russian campaign, like I just mentioned, left Napoleon very weakened, and so by March of 1814, so 2 years after his Russian campaign, France's capital, Paris, is occupied by these European powers. Right, it's a huge defeat for Napoleon and the French people. Right, remember the French people were able to hold off these invaders during the Legislative Assembly and the National Convention era, but they're not able to do it now. And instead of killing Napoleon, though, or executing him, what they actually do is they exile him to an island in the Mediterranean known as Elba. I'm going to show you a map in a minute. They also then, these monarchs, these allied powers like England, France, Prussia, and Austria, they restore the French monarchy. So again, from 1789 to 1815, we have so many changes in the government, and this is the latest edition. The monarchy is restored. It's actually Louis XVI's brother. So he's ruling. But then Napoleon escapes from his exile pretty dramatically and returns to France for 100 days. And for 100 days in the year 1815, Napoleon kind of rallies the support of the French people, wins some important battles. But ultimately, the Prussians and the British defeat Napoleon, and kind of the last major battle is in 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. And that battle ultimately kind of forces Napoleon to surrender for good. This time, though, the Allied powers are not taking it easy on Napoleon, and so instead of exiling him back to Elba, which is relatively close to France, they exile him to some island off the coast of Africa known as St. Helena. And in 1821, that's when Napoleon dies. Just to give you a sense of where these islands were. So his first exile here in Elba, the Star, is not very far off the coast of Italy and not very far to France, right? So he actually can land back in France and march through in 1815. But his second surrender, his second exile, is in St. Helena, right? So Elba is roughly up here where my mouse is now, and all the way down here is St. Helena, right? So really dramatic change. To give you a sense, St. Helena is a very mountainous small island, essentially in the middle of the Atlantic. They only recently, in the past 5 to 10 years, got internet access. And in 2017, their airport opened for their first international flight, right? So this island is incredibly remote and really was remote up until, it still is remote today, but very remote up until a couple of years ago. Before that, it would take weeks-long boat trip from South Africa to St. Helena. That was the kind of the route that was taken before the airport opened. So they were making they were not going to risk anything by exiling him here. They wanted to make sure he would never be a threat again, and they were successful. He spends about 6 years on this island before he dies. Right, and so one of the other questions we thought about, or I wanted you to think about going into this lecture, was not only was he a son or enemy of the revolution, but was he an enlightened despot or not? And so we talked about enlightened despots in the previous unit, right? They try to rule with almost complete control, but they do make some reforms to try to appease the people of their country. And so Napoleon does make tax reforms to ease the burden on the peasants and the middle class. He creates a national banking system to promote the economy. He does try to dismiss any corrupt officials to limit their abuses. He forms publicly funded schools, tries to appoint people based on merit and not on their status in life. But then he also does things like try to make an agreement with the Pope, right? So we talked about in the French Revolution how during the National Convention, right, the government took control of appointing bishops and paying the salaries of priests, right? They didn't want the outside independent church having any control. In 1801, he establishes a concordat, or essentially like an agreement with the Pope, where they restore the church in France and allow the Pope to appoint bishops, but they do limit some of the power still. So that that could be debatable whether or not he's an enlightened despot. And his Napoleonic Code is pretty strict and tough. And he replaces this idea of the revolution, right? This idea of fraternity, liberty, and equality, which is the rallying call of the French Revolution, to his call of order, security, and efficiency, right? And so you can think about that. Does that represent Enlightenment ideas? Does that represent absolutist ideas? And lastly, the last thing we have to talk about is kind of the aftermath of Napoleon, right? And so once Napoleon is defeated and exiled, the European powers meet to try to figure out how to prevent something like that from happening again, right? How to prevent another French Revolution. And so they meet in Vienna, which is today the capital of Austria, and they call it the Congress of Vienna, or meeting in Vienna. And the goals were to limit future French aggression, right? They don't want France becoming too powerful on the continent. They want to restore the balance of power in Europe, right? Not having one side, like France, for example, have too much influence and say, right? To limit warfare, you have to balance power. And they also try to restore Europe's royal families to power. So, for example, the restoration of the monarchy in France, a lot of those kingdoms in the Confederation of the Rhine, they try to restore power there, monarchies there. They also, at this meeting, decided to unite they agreed to allow the Netherlands to unite into one republic, known as the Dutch Republic. That Confederation of the Rhine, the German states now are kind of controlled by Austria, so it kind of helps expand the Austrian Empire. But Switzerland, which is kind of part of that German-speaking territory, is recognized for the first time as independent in 1815. So we have kind of the formation of some new nations based on nationhood, right? The Swiss people wanted to be their own people, the Dutch wanted to be their own nation. But you also had the restoration of some monarchies as well, like in France. Right? Spain, Italy, those monarchies are also restored. And essentially what the monarchs of Europe do then is they create what's called the Concert of Europe, which is an alliance among the European monarchs to stop future revolutions. Right? Because once these ideas of nationalism and revolutionism in France happen, they are going to spread elsewhere. And we'll see that in 1830, for example, there's a lot of revolutionary uprisings in Europe, and again in 1848. That's because these Enlightenment ideals and ideas never died. Just because the French Revolution ultimately, when the Republican government went back to a monarchy for a time, we'll go back to a republic afterwards as well. But once it goes back to that, it doesn't mean the ideas are gone. They're in people's heads. The ideas have spread throughout Europe. And on top of that, there's a growing sense of nationalism, right? Pride in a group's shared identity, right? And so what this really does is cause lots of small ethnic groups in places like Austria, for example, who's very ethnically diverse at the time, that empire, to want to be independent. And so you're going to start seeing revolutions in places like Czechoslovakia, or Hungary, or Croatia, right? All these places that were controlled by other people begin to want to be controlled by themselves. And so this rise of nationalism is going to be the next big thing that we talk about in this course.